Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all on this to this important online event. It marks the official launch of the Coalition for Organisational Integrity in Mozambique. And it is my great pleasure to be moderating the program. And we are delighted with the indication of attendance of just over 70 participants from a large variety of sectors at this webinar today. So once again, thank you for putting aside your valuable time to be part of this important event. Of course, we would rather be enjoying the beautiful view of the Indian Ocean and the wonderful hospitality of the Southern Sun in Maputo as we intended in March, but we have all been sabotaged by the virus. Nevertheless, this attendance far exceeds our expectations, and a big thank you to each of you. In December last year, at the swearing-in of the Prime Minister and 16 other ministers, President Nyusi spoke very strongly about the need for corruption to be addressed. He described it as, and I quote, a silent disease that is continuing to weaken the Mozambican state. And he went on to say, and I think this is a very powerful statement, it is one of the main obstacles to the development of our country. And I think what he says is borne out by studies done by the World Bank, which clearly show the correlation between levels of corruption and the ability of countries to maintain sufficiently high economic growth levels to support and sustain growth. The real situation is, and I quote from the World Bank report, is that the average income in countries with a high level of corruption is about a third of that of countries with a low level of corruption. Also, the infant mortality rate in such countries is about 3 times higher, and the literacy rate is 25% lower. These statistics are a wake-up call for not only Mozambique, but the whole African continent. So it is, as we've heard from many of you, our partners, that the launch of the coalition comes at a really good time. And we are delighted to be able to work with these incredible organizations in this wonderful country to ensure that the script changes slowly but surely. I'm going to quickly take you through today's program, which begins with the Executive Director of the Ethics Institute, Professor Leon van Vuuren, and he will outline the detail of the coalition and its objectives. This will be followed by the keynote address called Business Integrity, the Power of Collective Action. And this will be delivered by Professor Dion Rousseau, CEO of the Ethics Institute. Dr. Paul Forster is TEI's research specialist, and he will then discuss the business culture assessment. And we've asked the question, which we hope he will answer in his presentation: how much do you really know about your organization's culture? I'd like to alert you to an important opportunity that session will provide for coalition supporters. So I urge you not to disappear to collect your next cup of coffee during that presentation, or any of them for that matter. Paul's presentation will be followed by a short 10-minute break when you can grab that coffee, after which we get to the nitty-gritty and some of the difficult questions of the why and how of ethical practice. And Javita Fazenda from MultiChoice and Chris Curtis of Vodacom Mozambique will share their experience in creating an environment which enables integrity and ethical practice to flourish. Then our closing session will take us through the next steps. In other words, what now? Now that we've launched the coalition, what do we do with it? And I will close with some announcements about what we can expect during the coming months. I would like to mention briefly that the focus of the coalition project is on mainly multinational companies or organizations operating in an international context. And this remains the overarching criteria for participation in the coalition. It's been a considered focus, mostly because of the result of the enormous investment these organizations make in the development of business and human resources in countries in which they operate, and the reach that they extend in terms of business development in the supply chain particularly. This doesn't mean that smaller organizations involved today are not able to benefit. On the contrary, Your interest shown today will ensure that you remain on our mailing list for your sins, for our newsletters, and that you're invited to our annual information update events, which will expose you to the various organizations involved and the important networking of an event such as this. Just a note to say that the presentations and the recording of the webinar will be made available within the next week or so, and I will give further detail during the closing sessions as to how to access these. There is one important thing that I ask you to contribute today. No, it's not money. We do ask that you utilize the chat room to submit to us the issues which your organizations are dealing with in terms of ethics and integrity, and which have become a priority in your sector. This will help us plan our best practice sharing sessions and address these, and to bring the relevant expertise into the best practice sharing sessions in future. With that, and without further ado, I will hand you over to Professor Leon van Vuuren, who will answer the question, why a coalition for organizational integrity? Thank you, Leon.
Thank you, Barbara. It's really good to be with this group today. Bom dia to everyone. It's the fact that there are 71 people that have joined this morning's session is an indication that people are taking ethics seriously, ethics in business seriously in Mozambique, and that is a huge boost for the start of any such initiative, such as this coalition, for example. So you see, the title is the Coalition for Organizational Integrity. So what is this all about? Allow me to give you some background. Why a coalition for organizational integrity in Mozambique? And I need to take you back to 2009 to answer this question properly. In 2009, the company Siemens got a huge fine from the World Bank, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of euros fine for corruption in countries in which they operated, for fueling corruption in the countries in which they operated. When Siemens got this fine from the World Bank instructed them not to just dump the money into some bank account, but to actually prove that they used this fine, the money that came with the fine, for a good cause, namely to fight corruption in business across the world. They then put out a call to organizations to put in tenders to launch projects that would, of course, help Siemens spend this money. And at the Ethics Institute, we were very fortunate to get funding for this project. Our very first project was in Angola. That ended in 2014. And then we had our previous Siemens Integrity Initiative 5-year project in Mozambique from 2014 to 2019. This ended in September last year. The target project was business in Mozambique. We were very fortunate to have great supporting partners in the process, and any initiative like this cannot exist without partnerships. And we are proud to say that we were partnered by the Maputo Corridor Logistics Initiative, OCAM, which is a professional association for accountants and auditors in Mozambique, Ashish, and CTA, names that you're all familiar with. Unfortunately, the MCLI had to close its doors due to lack of funding, but the spirit remains with us, and the previous president of the MCLI, Barbara Mommen, is now one of Ethics Institute's associates and the project coordinator of the Mozambican project, which I'll tell you more about in a minute or two. So the Ethics Institute, what was our role? Our role was to be a facilitator and not to be at the forefront of everything that happens. We were there to assist our partners and to enable and empower them to take integrity to business in Mozambique. And important, we wanted to cover all sectors through collective action. If I say all sectors, it was much easier for us, obviously, to start with large multinationals in the private sector, but eventually we also moved and did a lot of work and did a lot of liaison with the public sector as well as the academic sector. It obviously takes time to build a network in particularly the public sector, but we have succeeded to do so. So let me tell you a bit about our project that we've just finished. The project goal was to fight corruption in Mozambique by capacitating the private and public sectors to implement anti-corruption initiatives and good practices, and then really important, the letters in red, while building local ethics management capacity. Often when projects like these are launched, some money goes into the country, it is spent, but when the money's finished, there's nothing to show for it. And in our case, what we wanted to show was an ethics management capacity, a sustained ability to fight corruption by managing ethics. The spirit of the project was, now I say this often, but some of you have heard this, but I really believe strongly in this, that you can't fight corruption by fighting corruption. If you just throw money at corruption, nothing much will happen. One has to bring across a type of capacity to understand what corruption is, and particularly how can one arm yourself to prevent it, and to when it does happen, to manage it. But prevention is extremely important in these terms. Importantly, enablement and capacity building. That was the spirit of our project, where we really focus on ethics awareness. In other words, taking the awareness of ethics in business to the people, and that's the employing organizations and employees. One way of building capacity is to convey ethical reasoning skills. We all know the difference between right and wrong, yet we don't always have those finer skills when we have to deal with a difficult ethical challenge or a dilemma. And this is why the acquisition of ethical reasoning skills is so important. And then lastly, and the most importantly, is ethical culture building. When one talks about ethics in organizations and integrity, the first things that come to mind are things like compliance, laws, policies that one should adhere to, and that one should get punished for when one violates those laws or policies. However, having policies and laws alone will not build a sustained way of ethical thinking in organizations. One has to build an ethics mindset where people have the same shared thoughts and share the same thinking about the value of ethics and how it can protect the organization's reputation. Paul will tell us a little bit more about ethical culture when he discusses the assessments. So I have to define ethics upfront. Otherwise, we always have someone coming back to us saying, but how do you define ethics or morality? Well, for the purpose of today, ethics and morality, we see them as the same thing, and they are defined in terms of three concepts. Ethics is what is good for the self and the other. The self could be an individual, a group, an organization, or even a country, and so could the other be. The challenge here is, what is the good? How does one define the good? And part of this project is to give people and organizations skills to identify, to collectively identify the good, so that there can be a good balance between the self and the other. In other words, that there's a continued mutually beneficial ethical relationship between any party and another party when doing business. So what does corruption do? Corruption distorts the sense of what is good. Amongst others, it makes people lose their sense of guilt and shame and remorse. And of course, greed blinds people to what is really good sustainably for business and for society as a whole. Also, corruption skews actions towards selfishness, because if you're only considered about yourself, you will be called selfish, and that is the opposite of being ethical. So the corruption has the effect that it sways the thinking towards the self. And what happens, of course, in this situation is that the other is neglected or even is harmed, that ethical harm is caused to the other, in other words, other stakeholders that one interact with. So what did the project achieve over 5 years? We built an extensive network. We have qualified trainers that are ready to assist your organizations as it stands right now to conduct ethics training and ethical leadership training. We have committed and influential project partners. There's an increased public sector interest, and this we saw towards the end of our project. As Barbara said earlier, in terms of Newsy's words, the public sector, they are slowly coming to the party. There's increased business ethics awareness, and our evaluations that we conducted in terms of the project impact actually indicated this statistically. Let me share with you a few numbers, 5 years in numbers. 3,610. Those were the business representatives that TI engaged with during the 5-year project, 5-year Mozambique project, 2014 to 2019. 106, the delegates in the annual ethics awareness event in 2017 that was addressed by the Honorable Graça Machel. 1,582 employees in business and leaders attended ethics awareness training through programs that we facilitated. 536, the number of key stakeholders that were engaged in cross-border anti-corruption interventions in Eswatini, Mozambique, and South Africa. 207, the number of representatives from business that attended the first 2 annual ethics conferences hosted by Ashish in 2018 and 2019. 54, the delegates that were capacitated in 2-by-4-day ethics officer training programs, what we call the EOTP. And 7, it is actually a significant number, the 7, because those are the trainers that I referred to earlier. These are our certified ethics officers that have been capacitated and licensed and accredited to provide business integrity interventions in Mozambique. They have all the tools, they have the skills, and they're at your organization's disposal. An ethics training video. This is a huge help for organizations and also a valuable training aid for our trainers. So allow me to share this video. There's a short clip from the 2-hour video that we have with you today. Just a very short clip.
Bem-vindo a esta produção. O conteúdo foi fornecido pelo The Ethics Institute. Demonstraremos que entender e depois aplicar as éticas nas organizações não é tão difícil como as pessoas às vezes pensam. Pensar e agir de forma ética no local de trabalho exige estar atento à presença de ética em todas as operações e relações comerciais. Portanto, ser eticamente consciente. Também é necessário que nos debruçarmos sobre o que a ética empresarial ou ética nas organizações significa, porque é importante que as organizações sejam éticas e o papel que você deve desempenhar nisso. Em suma, esta produção proporcionará uma boa dose de bom senso ético.
MTN's vision, mission and strategy not only focuses on the business objectives that we would like to fulfill, principles of an ethical organization.
Palavras para nos ajudar a focar sobre e comunicar eficazmente sobre a ética. Uma compreensão da importância da ética para as organizações. Por que as organizações investem em programas sobre ética? Esclarecimento sobre o seu papel como funcionário, quer questor ou não, no respeito e na defesa dos padrões éticos da organização, o que a sua responsabilidade acarreta. Por isso, vamos agora começar a nossa viagem em tomar conhecimento sobre a ética empresarial.
I think that illustrates some of the contributions that we've made to business in Mozambique. And as I said, it's a very valuable training aid. Let's go back to the word fighting. And this is a very, very well-known saying in Mozambique, a luta continua, the fight continues. So we were fortunate that we could continue our fight as well. And this, we are happy to announce that we were lucky enough to secure the Mozambique Siemens 3 initiative funding for our next 5-year project in Mozambique. This project kicked off in 2019 and will culminate in September 2024. And the purpose of this is collective action to advance business integrity in Mozambique. The project goal is to establish an effective collective action platform to effect significant change in business conduct as thought leaders engage in the sharing of best practices. There are 3 project objectives. Objective 1, to establish and maintain a collective action coalition for organizational integrity in Mozambique. And that is what today's session is about, is the launch of that very coalition. Objective 2 is to build ethics management capacity within the Coalition for Organizational Integrity. So we are at your disposal to help you build an ethics management capacity within your organizations. And our last objective, and let's not forget the small and medium enterprises, to build ethics and anti-corruption capacity for small and medium enterprise suppliers. And the great thing about this is that these are your suppliers, your organization's suppliers, that we will help you capacitate so that they can, when they deal with you, that they can also adhere to principles of ethical behavior. Our project approach is to facilitate dialogue, to stimulate collective action. It's also an opportunity for exposure for our activity partners, Ashish, OCAM, CTA. TI, the Ethics Institute, will subsidize events, training, and administrative coordination. We will enable and empower through training and events, awareness creation, etc. And of course, through networking. Ethics can only be acquired, and the self and the other can only be balanced properly if people talk to each other through networking. And we will provide subject matter content. The Ethics Institute, we regard ourselves as subject matter experts, and we would like to take that to Mozambique and share some of that knowledge with you. What is our basis? Financial control. I think we are the role of the Ethics Institute in this particular project is to make sure that the Siemens money is spent responsibly and accountably, and that a certain impact is made. We follow a scientific approach. We follow a change management approach. And we have very strict quality control in what we do. We also follow principles of project management. But today is a very special day. The focus today is the official launch of the Coalition for Organizational Integrity in Mozambique. Coalição pela Integridade Organizacional. We are very proud to say that today is the launch of this coalition. And I trust going forward that you will support the coalition, that you will contribute to its activities. We do not ask for financial contribution. We ask just for your enthusiastic participation in the activities. I'm going to hand over to our CEO at the Ethics Institute, Professor Dion Rousseau. He will talk to you about business integrity, the power of collective action. After which, and at the end of the session today, I will again tell you a few things of what we intend with the coalition. So thank you for listening, and over to Dion.
A very hearty word of welcome to everyone attending this morning. We are really grateful to have you here as part of this historic day where we launch the Coalition for Organizational Integrity. I also want to convey a word of congratulations to my colleagues, Celia and Leon, and also our associate Barbara and all our other partners in Mozambique who made it possible to have this launch despite all the challenges of COVID. We all know how COVID placed severe restrictions on travel, on gatherings, and it really tells a lot about their imagination and about their creativity to be able to launch this despite all the restrictions that we are currently facing. I was asked to talk this morning about business integrity, the power of collective action, and it's a topic that is close to my heart. As the Ethics Institute, we've been involved in quite a number of collective action activities, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. But let's start at the beginning. Why should we put so much emphasis on ethics? This is probably one of the questions that we encounter most often. Why should we make time and resources and people available for ethics? Can't we just work on the assumption that people are good by nature and that they will behave well? Well, sometimes we hear the case for attending to ethics being made in a negative sense, in the sense that people are reminded what can happen if you don't act in an ethical manner. In other words, we are often reminded of the very high risk of unethical behavior, and that things like scandal can follow as a result of unethical behavior that can tarnish your reputation or can put you totally out of business. We also know that when there's not a strong ethical culture in an organization, that the organization then is prone to acts of fraud and corruption. When people are not treated with respect, when they don't get quality products and quality service, we are likely to alienate our clients, which, as we all know, is the lifeblood of our organizations. And there's also a lot of studies that tells us that if there's an unethical culture in an organization where people aren't respected and aren't being treated in a fair manner, that staff, if they have the opportunity, would leave as quickly as they can. And then Leon already alluded to huge financial penalties that can be slammed on companies because of unethical practices. And probably the thing that people most fear is that they might end up in prison as a result of unethical and unsavory practices in which they were involved. So very often the case is made in a negative way. It's almost as if people are scared into being ethical. And at the Ethics Institute, we find it very important to also emphasize that one should be ethical, not because you are scared of scandal or penalties or imprisonment or whatever, but that one should be ethical out of conviction. And because you understand and are convinced that if you are being ethical, it will assist you in running an effective and a sustainable business. And I think the opportunities that we typically associate with an organization with a strong ethical culture is, first of all, that it has a good reputation, that it would easily inspire trust in investors, that it will encourage clients to be loyal to the company, but very important also that it is typical of organizations with strong ethical cultures that they have a good staff morale, in the sense of staff that are dedicated, that are committed, that are willing to walk the extra mile for the organization. Because we all know that is ultimately what makes the difference in your performance. But finally, I strongly believe that there is a direct link between the longevity or the sustainability of an organization and its ethical conduct. But here's the big thing that we always need to be reminded of, and that is that important as ethics is, it can never manage itself. Like any other aspect of our business, whether it is strategy or finance or production or sales or whatever, it needs to be managed. And here's a stark reminder from a saga that is still playing out, the Steinhoff company that originally started in South Africa, but is now as a primary listing in Germany. This is something that they said in the corporate governance report of 2011. In that specific report, they said, Steinhoff has not established a formal process for obtaining assurance on ethical awareness and ethical compliance throughout the group. Now, what they basically were saying in this one sentence is that they can't give us any assurance that they do something, or anything for that matter, to make sure that people are, number one, aware of their ethical standards, and number two, that if they are aware, that they actually abide, that they comply with these standards. Now, that sounds like a very honest recognition of something that they are lacking. But what is very worrisome is that we found exactly that same sentence without any change in the next 5 corporate governance reports. So for 6 years in a row, this company was basically reporting to their stakeholders, we are doing nothing to ensure that people are aware of our ethical standards, nor do we do anything to ensure that people abide by these standards. And therefore, it really came as no surprise when in the next year, 2017, the scandal broke. And this company is stumbling from one crisis to the next in an attempt to try and survive. So therefore, it is very important that we should understand that we should do something proactively to manage ethics in our organizations. And to a large extent, as Leon already explained in his introduction, this whole project is about building that ethics management capacity in organizations. But it is very important that we should not only have ethics management programs, but that there should be a deeply entrenched ethical culture. In other words, it should become normal practice. It should become a habit. It should become second nature to do the right thing, even when nobody is watching. And this is something, this emphasis on culture is something that we see on a worldwide scale now, that organizations around the world realize that just having an ethics compliance program isn't good enough. It needs to move much deeper into the fiber, into the DNA of the organization, and an ethical culture should be established. Here's just an example from a recent publication by the Financial Reporting Council in the United Kingdom called Corporate Culture and the Role of Boards, where they start by saying, a healthy culture both protects and generates value. It is therefore important to have a continuous focus on culture rather than waiting for a crisis. Now, there is a very direct link between ethical culture and ethical conduct in organizations. And this is something that we found in a study that we did last year amongst large and listed companies here in South Africa. And during the run of this project, we hope to do a similar survey also in Mozambique. But here's what we found when we started analyzing the data that we found. And what we did here is we divided our sample in organizations with poor ethical cultures and organizations with good or strong ethical cultures. And then we compared them in terms of how they responded to the question that you see there on your screen. And the question was, have you observed unethical conduct in the last year? And you can see the vast difference. In companies with poor ethical cultures, almost 6 out of 10 people said, yes, we observed unethical conduct over the last year. While in companies with good ethical cultures, only about 1 in 4 people observe that. So that just shows you the direct correlation between the strength of your ethical culture and the prevalence of unethical conduct in your organization. We followed up this question using the same division between companies with poor cultures and good ethical cultures, and asked people, so, okay, you have observed unethical conduct over the last year, but did you report what you observed? And now we see exactly the opposite occurring, that although there were high incidents of unethical conduct in companies with poor ethical culture, the reporting rate was significantly lower than in companies with good ethical cultures, where there was a low number of incidences of unethical conduct, but you can see a much higher reporting rate. And that is why we always want, when we work to organizations, we want to walk with them. We want to take them on a journey to ultimately make ethics part of who they are, of their DNA, of their identity as a corporation. Now, Leon already alluded to the fact that the Siemens Integrity Initiative is very much focused on fighting corruption around the world. And he also shared something with you that is very central to our approach, and that is that you don't fight corruption by fighting corruption. You fight corruption by building strong ethical cultures in organizations. Now, there are 3 different levels on which corporations can fight corruption. The first one is that they obviously can take certain internal actions. They can put a number of initiatives and processes in place to build that strong ethical culture in the organization. But then they can also collaborate with other organizations or with service providers or with professional bodies to assist them in building that strong ethical culture and being able to fight corruption. But finally, they can also engage in collective action. And collective action, we can see here the Global Compact, that United Nations initiative. In their Business Against Corruption, a framework for action, they say collective action is an advanced step to fight corruption and helps to level the playing field. Now, if we look for a definition of collective action, we can say that anti-corruption collective action is an agreement among different stakeholders to implement a joint program with the aim of reducing corruption. And you can see this comes pretty close to what Leon just described as the aim of this coalition for organizational integrity. Such coalitions can either be private or public sector-led. In our case, it will be a private sector-led organization, and collective action can take many different forms. It can create a general forum where organizations with a commitment to reduce corruption can come together, and that is pretty much what we are doing with this coalition for organizational integrity. Sometimes collective action can be project focused, such as, for example, when a new port is being constructed or a new mine is being developed or a new airport is being built, then you can have collective action by all the players, all the different contracting firms and their supply chain to have a focus on reducing corruption in that specific project. Or sometimes it can be problem focused. When there is a problem about corruption in a specific sector, you can come together and can have a problem-focused collective action. If I look at what really drives collective action, because this has become a popular tool around the world to fight corruption, and we see it on all continents, and comes with the support of organizations like Transparency International. I already mentioned the United Nations Global Compact, who strongly support it. The World Bank supports it. In other words, collective action is being seen as a very important instrument in fighting corruption in societies. And all these different forms of collective action are being driven by factors such as, number one, frustration about an uneven playing field. And in a minute, I'll show you an example of that. Secondly, it's driven by the fact that there are now international anti-corruption standards that are so-called extraterritorial. In other words, they apply right across the world, and nobody can escape them. It is also driven by the need for stimulating confidence in investors. And another driving force is that multinational companies are becoming ever more cautious about the conduct of their supply chain. And they want their suppliers, and more so their small and medium enterprise suppliers, to adhere to ethical practices and to avoid corruption. Let me briefly just give you an example of each of these, and I've picked deliberately examples where we as the Ethics Institute were involved. And you would see that a number of them was also supported by the Siemens Integrity Initiative. The first one is where the driver was an uneven playing field. And this happened in a specific industry sector in Kenya, where there was substantial corruption in the port authorities. So when it came to the import and export of goods in this industry, some people bribed their way through the port authorities, which means that some people had to pay certain taxes and other people didn't pay that. And therefore, the players in this specific industry came together and they said, as an industry, what we want to clean up our act. We make a joint commitment to business integrity in our sector of the economy. And on the basis of that, they started engaging with the industry itself, started to engage with government and with the port authorities. And as a result of that, they could level that playing field so that everyone is treated equally when it comes to the imports and export of the commodities that they were trading in. And as a result of that, the problem disappeared. So it was a very much a problem-focused collective action. It was ad hoc, once off, and when the problem disappeared, the initiative also stopped. So it was a purely organic initiative. A second example is the Coalition of Ethical Operations in South Africa. And this was a group of multinational companies who all fall to some extent under the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA, or under the United Kingdom Bribery Act, the UKBA. And they knew that under these two pieces of legislation, they need to ensure that not only they, but also their supply chain adhere to strong anti-corruption practices. And they started on the founding conviction of no company can solve a global problem on its own. And therefore, they understood that as multinationals, they need to come together. And they did that by signing a pledge of collaboration where they said, we will share best practices in promoting an ethical culture and preventing corruption. We will collaborate in training our supply chain and more specifically our small and medium enterprises to also act in an ethical and anti-corrupt manner. And from time to time, we also pledge to engage in voluntary occasional collective action. And this is something that we did also with the support of the Siemens Integrity Initiative in South Africa. A third example comes from Angola, also supported by the Siemens Integrity Initiative, where we engage with the local community, the business community there, to develop principles for responsible business in Angola. And what they wanted to do, given the corrupt image that Angola as a country had and is still struggling with, is to signal the ethical commitment to the international investment community. And they did that by developing and promoting a national standard of ethical conduct in business, which was supported not only by the most important chambers of commerce in Angola, but also by companies signing up to these principles for responsible business in Angola. A final example where the focus was on the supply chain to multinational companies, also a project that we as the Ethics Institute were involved in Mauritius that was called the Private Sector Anti-Corruption Task Team. And this is where local companies came together once again to adopt ethical standards and anti-corruption compliance programs, and then demonstrated their commitment, first of all, by signing an integrity pledge where they committed themselves to ethical conduct in their business. In other words, also when they supply to multinational companies, they wanted to signal to them that they can trust them to be ethical. And they also developed a self-assessment tool to assess them against this integrity pledge that they signed. And this really provided a basis for independent assurance by external assurance providers. So if a multinational company said, well, I'm not going to take you on your word, I want an external assurance, in other words, an external audit of your commitment, they were in a position to offer that. And then companies who passed that were given the right to officially use the Integrity Pledge logo after external independent verification. So all of these are just to show you that there are right around the world, and I've just picked from a few that we were involved in, but we find it on all continents, a big emphasis on collective action. And the reason why this has become popular is, number one, because it increases the impact and credibility of individual action. In other words, when you as a company on your own take a stance against corruption, it is not as powerful as when you have a number of other partners who are joining you in that effort. And that, of course, contributes to bringing vulnerable individual players into an alliance of like-minded organizations. You have now other organizations who can support you. The very important thing is when you get such a collective action, you are leveling the playing field between competitors. Because if there's a lot of corruption, it's a very uneven playing field. When we stand together and say, we're not going to tolerate this, then the playing field becomes level. And I think very importantly, especially in the context of developing countries, is that such collective action can complement or even temporarily substitute for weak local laws and weak anti-corruption practices. And ultimately, by engaging in such an initiative, we contribute to building safe, just, and prosperous societies. And I think this is a very meaningful activity to be involved in. So here we stand this morning at the launch of the Coalition for Organizational Integrity. I'm not going to repeat again of what the objectives of this coalition is, and these will also be shared with you. So, what are the key success factors in an effective collective action initiative? Well, number one, it's about having a well-selected focus. In other words, not trying to be everything to everybody, but to have a very deliberate focus on certain aspects as the ones that we've just outlined for you on the previous slide. The second key is that it should not be mandatory. It should be voluntary participation. It's a coalition of the willing. In other words, those people who share our commitment to building a corrupt-free society. These are the people that should join that on a voluntary basis. Obviously, when businesses work together, there's always the danger that they can be perceived to be colluding, and that is why it is important to avoid perceptions of collusion by involving independent parties, such as the Ethics Institute, but also such as our partners in Mozambique that Leon already mentioned. And then I think key to the success of any collective action is that we should celebrate achievements. And that is why it is important that we should share achievements not only in the coalition, but also to the outside world. I left the fifth one for last because this is the make or break factor: leadership, commitment, and support. Without leaders of organizations such as the people that we have this morning in this webinar, this initiative stands absolutely no chance of being successful. And it is therefore that we are delighted to have the leadership of organization represented here this morning. But in order to drive this project, we rely on your continued leadership commitment and support for this coalition. So let me finish with the words of John F. Kennedy, who reminded us that a rising tide lifts all boats. And this is obviously so true also of business. As individual businesses, as individual organizations, we know that we depend on a healthy economy, a healthy workforce, a healthy society, and a healthy natural environment. And it's only when all these things are in good shape that we as companies can perform at our best. And I think an initiative like this one is typically one that can lift the tide of economic soundness, societal soundness, and environmental soundness, and can only bring good for everyone involved. In that sense, an initiative like this can be a rising tide that lifts all boats. I thank you, and I hand back to Barbara. Thank you.
So we will move on then, thank you, Dion, to Paul, Dr. Paul, who will be discussing the business culture assessment. And Paul, can I steal some thunder quickly and
Please.
Just say that supporters of the coalition, once we have your formal support, you will have access to the business culture assessment, which will give you a very good picture of how your organization views itself in terms of ethical culture. It's not an audit, it's not a finger-pointing exercise, but a very helpful tool to get insight into, if you're struggling with the issues, where do we start? What are the priority issues? So Paul, over to you. And if you would like to add some clarity at the appropriate point on that, we'd be very grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Leon, as well as Dion, for their contributions here. I think we want to talk a little bit about culture, and I think one of the main objectives of this process is to fight corruption by building ethical organizational cultures. And building those ethical organizational cultures in organizations allows us to ultimately view organizations differently. I think that we, for too long, seen organizations as brick and mortar buildings, places where things are done, when in fact an organization is a complex set of relationships that exists not only internally between the organization and its employees, but also externally with its customers, its clients, its shareholders, its suppliers, and so forth. So it is actually a complex set of relationships, and we have to look closely at changing the way in which organizations do business so that they can become more aware that these relationships matter and that ethics is at the heart of those relationships. And I'm going to try and provide you with a bit of a definition around organizational culture, but also tell you more about how we aim to measure this culture. Because one of the main objectives here is we cannot change things if we cannot measure them. So we are offering a premier culture assessment to look at your organization from a culture as well as from a conduct perspective to better understand what is happening, what we need to change, and what we need to develop. For me in South Africa, corruption is actually about toilets. That might sound strange, but in South Africa, we have a big problem in our schooling systems and so on with pit toilets, which have claimed a number of lives of children falling into these pit toilets. And there was a study done I think it was about a year and a half ago, to look at how much it costs to install a pit toilet. And after all the corruption, after all the bribery, after all the procurement, it costs approximately 150,000 South African rand to build a single toilet. Whereas if I go to my local builder's warehouse or my local shop, I can purchase a toilet for less than 300 rand. So the price of a toilet becomes 150,000 rand because of corruption, bribery, and the way in which these relationships are used for a negative side. So I think it is important for us to see corruption, that it has real effects. And the only way to fight it, the cure, is building an organizational culture. So the first step, as I've said, is to measure, is to ultimately understand what your organization's culture looks like. And many of us may have a feeling that our organization might be doing well or poorly in certain areas, but we really need to understand what's going on from an objective perspective. And more importantly, to benchmark that with other organizations to see where you may rank. And we have that capability. And I think this is so important for us to at least know to a minimum where we are and what we need to do to build that culture. And that is ultimately where we need to do our work, is to build a culture in our organization to develop ethics going forward. So an ethics risk assessment is something that we want to do for you in your organization going forward. And this is the definition of that. It is a quantitative measurement process that allows the organization to objectively benchmark, in other words, rank its ethics risk and mitigate this risk over time. If we know what's wrong, we can fix it. If we don't know, we are taking a shot in the dark. The ethics risk assessment usually involves the measurement of three things which we will be helping you and your organizations to measure. Firstly, an ethical culture. What is it like in the organization? How do we do things around here? Secondly, we're looking very closely at conduct or behavior. In other words, are there any behaviors that are observable that we can change? And lastly, to also look at what ethics management interventions your organization has and how effective they may be. Ethical culture has got many ways of looking at it. It's got many definitions, and very often it's become so abstract that people don't actually understand what an ethical culture is. But let me share with you the importance of ethical culture. If your organization has an ethical culture, it has two things. One, organizations with ethical culture are high morale organizations. It improves the productivity of that organization. It improves the quality of the services that that organization offers. So it is at the heart of what the organization considers to be good and right behavior. And it is strange to me that people still see ethical culture or ethics as fuzzy, as soft issue. It is key to what an organization does. So I want to share with you a little bit around the research that has been done into ethical cultures and how they influence the organization in terms of some of its other objectives. Ethical culture has been linked to job satisfaction very strongly of employees. It has been linked to organizational commitment. In other words, whether employees feel loyal towards the organization. It has been linked very strongly to turnover intentions, whether people are willing to leave your organization or whether talent wants to leave the company. It has been linked to loyalty of employees, and as well as their engagement to the organization, whether they actually care about what the organization does. It's also been linked to antisocial behavior, in the sense that if you don't have an ethical culture, or if you have a poor ethical culture, ultimately antisocial behavior thrives. It's been linked to bullying intimidation if it is not present, to corporate illegality, to deception, and to the contravention of company rules, as well as the falsification of reports within the organization itself, including audit reports, financial reports, and so on. And it also increases organizational misconduct if that ethical culture is not established. So these are all the negative outcomes if an ethical culture is non-existent in your organization or is poorly developed, as well as political and production deviance. Ethical culture has also been linked to, if you have it, to higher levels of accountability, improved ethical behavior, improved ethical decision-making of the organization and the people who work in it, improved ethical judgment, better ethical intentions, a greater moral imagination, improved moral intensity, in other words, wanting to do the right thing, and organizational citizenship behavior. Now, you may ask, what is an ethical culture? What do we need to look at that formulates this culture? Well, many studies have been done in the past to look at what differentiates a good organization from one that is ultimately prone to corruption, bribery, scandals, and risk. And these are the defining characteristics of what makes an organization ethical. Firstly, whether or not employees feel that there is ethics, accountability, and responsibility, whether the organization holds people accountable and responsible for their behavior in a fair and consistent manner. Whether employees feel committed to ethics, whether they feel that it's important for business. And we're talking here about non-managerial employees. Whether middle management, line management, supervisory management, whether these individuals role model ethical behavior and enforce whether or not, or ultimately provide evidence as to why ethics should be important for business. And then, of course, senior leadership commitment to ethics, whether or not people at a senior level in the organization stand for what is right, act as ethical role models. Whether an organization talks about what is right and wrong, whether or not that is something that comes into meetings and discussions, whether or not it treats its people well, fairly, and with respect. And lastly, whether the organization and its employees are actually aware of ethics, whether they are aware through training initiatives what is right, what is wrong. Are they familiar with the values of your organization, the convictions, the code of conduct, and so forth? Now, ethical culture is not one of those things. If we look at ethical culture, it can be made up of those things I mentioned: leadership commitment, middle management commitment, the ethical treatment of people both inside and outside the organization, ethics talk, whether the organization engage in talk about ethics, or ethics awareness. But what ethical culture is not one of those things. It is where all of those things overlap. If you have these things in your organization, you ultimately have an ethical culture. And this is the key aspect that we need to look at in developing in organizations. Additionally, in Africa, specifically in Southern Africa, organizations are playing a much more key role in training people about ethics. We have a situation where we have so many parentless households. Where are children getting their integrity from? And when they enter the work environment, do they have that integrity, or is it up to us in organizations to help them build that? And I think this is where we play such a big role as an organization in order to develop that integrity in individuals going forward. The strength of an ethical culture, we either say that it could be fragile or weak, that it could be underdeveloped, in other words, a small part of what the organization does, but it doesn't take center stage. Developing, where it has some clout, in other words, the organization is trying its best to build those aspects I mentioned earlier, but it is not yet at a point where it underpins everything that the organization does. And lastly, it could have a mature culture, where organizations come to the realization, have built an ethical consciousness, you could say, to realize that we are a relationship, we are not just a business, and therefore we need ethics at the heart of everything that we do. Now, if you look at organizational culture as that blue block over there, ethical culture, is it fragile or weak? Is it a small part of what we do? Is it almost insignificant? Is it something that we look at, but it's not really a thing that underpins how we operate as an organization? Is it something substantial that we do, but it's not yet forming the core aspect of what we do? In other words, our organizational culture is not yet synonymous with an ethical culture. Or is ethics part and parcel of who we are? And that is the key thing about building an ethical culture. I want to ask you a very broad question. And actually, if you have some pen and paper in front of you, or you can just do this in your head. If you say yes to each of these questions, please score 1 point. And if you say no, 0 points. And just count up out of the 12 questions that I'm going to ask you, how many ones you have in total. And then we can look a bit later whether you rank in terms of your organizational culture. And as I say, this is a simplified way of doing this, but just gives us an insight into what we need to look at in organizations. So firstly, do people in your organization do the right thing because they want to, not because they are told to? So if you say yes, you will score 1 point. Do people talk about ethics openly, or is it something that's hidden, that's taboo? Are all stakeholders treated with respect? And that includes external stakeholders, as well as our employees. Does leadership verbalize and act upon their commitment to ethics? In other words, they don't just talk ethics, they actually do it. Are business decisions tested for their ethical consequences before we make them? Or do we prioritize the bottom line in everything that we do? Are people not afraid to speak up or raise concerns about what is right or wrong within the organization? Number 7, is ethics training provided also for new employees? Do we induct them into our culture, into our values, into our code of conduct? Are people rewarded and recognized for their ethical behavior? And this doesn't have to be a monetary reward, but do we at least recognize people and catch those who do right in the organization? Are transgressors dealt with swiftly, decisively, transparently, and consistently? If mistakes are made, is there no hesitation to apologize and take corrective action? Are ethics-related codes and policies clear to people in the organization? Do people understand their content? Or does everyone just have a differing view of what this means? And lastly, do we set realistic performance targets in our organization? Such an important factor, because if they're unrealistic, people often do unethical things to reach them. So out of these 12, I want you to just think about how many you've scored. Have you scored a 6 out of 12? Have you scored a 3 out of 12, etc.? Let's look at what this means. So if you scored between 0 and 3, you have a fragile or a weak ethical culture. This means that ethics is such a small part of what you do that it actually doesn't really impact anything in your organization, and you're at high risk of scandals, corruption, and other unethical behavior. If you scored between a 4 and a 6, you're underdeveloped. There are some areas where it's developing, but it's not yet where it should be. Between 7 and 9, it's a substantial part of what we do, but it's not yet synonymous with our organizational culture. And you would score in the mature category if you got 10 or more in terms of this particular poll. So I want you to think about that when you've scored it. And remember, you're one person. We also need to look at everyone in the organization and what they think the organization does right and wrong. So are we fragile, underdeveloped, developing, or is our ethical culture a part of our organizational culture in total? How will we measure ethical culture maturity in your organizations? Well, we have something called the Ethical Culture Maturity Indicator. This is a validated assessment that closely evaluates the ethical culture maturity level of organizations by measuring those things I mentioned earlier. It's composed of a total index. We give you a total score and where you rank compared to over 60 private, public, and state-owned organizations that we benchmark you to. So we look at where do you fall in comparison to these other organizations. And this should give you a very good indication of how you're doing in terms of your competitors and your peers in the market. The instrument measures those 7 critical components I mentioned earlier, and it has been validated using premier psychometric techniques. So this is not a willy-nilly instrument. We've looked very closely at its dimensionality, what it measures using research processes, and also whether it is a reliable tool, whether it measures consistently and whether it measures without error. Additionally, the ECME uses advanced scaling procedures, so we are able to, once we've measured your organization, to identify any responses which may be socially desirable or any fake responses in the data quite easily. And there is a technical manual upon request. Also, this instrument has been peer-reviewed by the University of Johannesburg and the UNISA School for Business Leadership, so our homework has been checked by others. There are also specific business benchmarks that are available upon request so that we can actually look at, if you sit, for example, in the telecoms industry, what do you look like in comparison to other telecoms organizations in that industry? So we have, in general, a state-owned enterprise norm, a public sector norm, as well as a private sector norm. So we can compare you against those types of organizations, as well as telecoms, health, financial, and others. But measuring culture is not enough. We also have to look at the behavior of the organization. And this will form part of our initiative later in the year, where, or later down the line of this process, where we will look at behavior and how it compares to your culture. And we use for this the ethics behavior risk indicator, which is a different tool. It's also a validated tool which looks closely at counterproductive work behavior, in other words, unethical behavior and the frequency thereof day to day. And we also compare you to over 65 private, public, and state-owned organizations. So we rank you in terms of that behavior that you may observe in that organization. It again measures 7 components, similar to the ECMIA that I mentioned earlier. And again, this has also been validated according to scientific methods. We know what it measures, and we know that it's reliable. Additionally, the EBRI also uses those advanced scaling procedures, so we can pick up fake or duplicate responses or socially desirable responses. And there is a manual available. And we also can give you specific benchmarks to the SOE, public, private, telecoms, financial, healthcare, and so forth. The last thing that we want to measure is something called the ethics management risk indicator. And what this does is it's a tool that allows the organization to measure its ethics management interventions for their efficacy. In other words, do we have a whistleblowing line? Are people aware of this? Do people know where to go for advice on ethics? And so forth. It allows the ethics function or department to effectively gauge whether they've implemented the correct management interventions and whether or not those are effective. It allows the ethics function or department to track the progress of those initiatives. So we aim to not just measure, but remeasure and see whether or not there has actually been an improvement once we've done certain interventions in your organization. It's not good enough to think that we've made a difference. We need to actually see whether we have made a real difference. I hope that gives you some insight into organizational culture and what we aim to measure in your organization. These measurement initiatives will help us to ultimately target areas to change in your organization. I thank you very much for your time, and I hope to chat to you a bit later through the chat process here if you have any questions. Thank you.
It's my great pleasure to welcome Javita Fazenda, who is Head of Regulatory Affairs at MultiChoice Mozambique, and Chris Curtis, who is CFO or Chief Financial Officer at Vodacom Mozambique. Javita has a long history of work in ethics and compliance, and she has a master's degree which specialized in human rights law. And she's a very sought after speaker on ethics and good governance and has enormous experience. Chris himself has worked in Mozambique since 2012, am I right, Chris? And can you hear us?
8 years, yeah, eight years, a long time.
Yeah, and you've worked all over the world, Chile, London, South Africa, in various sectors, including accounting, audit, and the international financial sector. Both of our panelists have had significant experience in working with and starting new initiatives to bring about ethical culture. And Paul's presentation to us was very timeless, and I think the whole environment that we've got set very well by the 3 presentations leads beautifully into the first question, and I'm going to start from the big picture perspective first. And I will ask you, Javita, to start, if you don't mind. In your experience, and I want you to please refer to really good examples of what the bigger picture issues are for organizations that are dealing in countries where ethics and integrity is a challenge.
Thank you for inviting me to this panel, and it's a great honor to be part of the panel, and with Chris, who I've worked with for the last years at Vodacom. So going on to your question, Barbara, I think that there was a question here on the actually it was on the Q&A, and yes, about the environment, how that influences the business, yeah, and how people do business. So I think that that's one of the biggest challenges for corporations going into some of this market. High corruption rates, and I'm talking about big and small corruption. That's one of the biggest challenges, but also I think that that's, from my experience, is one of the key the key mottos for a coalition like the one that we're trying to establish here, which is business coming together to change an environment that's not the environments they want to do business in, the environments that they want to grow their business in. So it's the social construct is coming into a social contract where people think that this is the way we do things here and there's no other way. It's breaking those beliefs and setting a new way of doing business, which is kind of helping people unlearn old habits and gain new ones. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges.
Thank you, Davita. And I like what you say there about unlearning what is common practice. Very important. Chris, you're in an organization that is fairly advanced in its, well, I would put it in the category of mature in terms of ethical culture, but that doesn't preclude you from the challenges of working in an environment where corruption is rife.
Wow.
What are the big issues?
We're not going to have enough time today to even start exploring it.
No.
I'll tell you, we're on a journey. So there's no way I would say that we in Vodacom have arrived. It's nonsense. Although I could tick the vast majority of those questions with a 1, it's a painful journey. So let me just share some insights, and just stop me when you say enough. The tone has to start from the top. You have to have your leadership deeply committed to the long-term sustainability of the organization, and to really grapple with and really deeply understand what the long-term damage that's done to a company and to a country through improper practices. So
Chris, can I just stop you there and ask you, can you give us examples of that? Because I know that people know about it, but it's something that we don't talk about enough.
No, we have to talk about it. You have to put it on the table. So there are 2 words that are very prevalent in the Mozambican society. One is a balada. Balada means deal, technically, but it refers to kickbacks. And the balada culture is rife. It's really deeply rooted. And I'll share some real life examples, unfortunately. And the other one is cabritismo, which is talks about the goat. That it's a word that means where the goat is tethered, that's where you eat. So people have massive issues to do with conflicts of interest, and I'll share some of those examples as well. So with the balada culture, just to give you an idea of how pervasive it is, there are lots of companies in Mozambique that literally, if they're not prepared to play that balada culture, and the rates can go from 10% up to 100% kickback. Some of the entities that unfortunately are out there have people in their procurement teams that are so corrupt that literally they demand 100% pay, kickback for whatever's being supplied. And it's really hits you in the face. And I'll share later on some of the frustration and what you have to do. Ultimately, you need the cooperation of your suppliers to work with you to bring evidence forward to actually be able to get people moved out of positions. And I met the one supplier in October last year, and I asked this person, I said, right, well, share with me, how bad is it? Because we'd managed to get the evidence then to remove somebody. And she said to me that 3 out of their top 4 customers were demanding payments like this. And I immediately said, well, now you've only got 2, because obviously we had found one that and we, in this particular case, we had a staff member that was taking 20% as a kickback. And it was shocking. When we saw all the practices that were going on, and this lady was terrified, absolutely terrified of the potential implications. And what was interesting for me was there are lots of stories in Mozambique. You have Banco Austral, which is a bank where somebody was assigned by the central bank to investigate this particular bank, and he got thrown out of the 7th floor building, you know, 7th floor. And when I was carrying out investigations at the bank, I had somebody from an audit firm come to me and say, do you realize how dangerous this is, you going forward and doing these investigations, forensic audits, to try and get the evidence? And I joked and I laughed and I said, well, what would it cost? $5,000 to get me knocked off? And she said, no, you've misunderstood me. $500 would be all that it takes to get you bumped off, and $5,000, your entire family. And I was like, are you serious? And so you know, obviously when you're carrying out the investigations, you don't stand on a soapbox or on a rooftop and shout, by the way, I'm investigating X and Y, because obviously if you do that, then people are desperate and they'll, you know, seek desperate measures. Now, it's quite tricky because you carry out an investigation, and the investigation could be because of a speak up. You know, we've got a whistleblowing policy, but effectively it's a whistleblowing or speak up. And you can carry out an investigation and get to the end of it and not actually find the evidence. And it's incredibly frustrating. So if you can't get the evidence, you can always resort to, in the case of rotating a staff member into a different role and move them. So, you know, don't leave them in that same position of power. But the best avenue that I've found so far has been through our suppliers or parties that are actually involved in making the payments. So you go and have a face-to-face chat with them, and you explain that we want to work together. We give them a period of amnesty, because obviously you can end up in a situation where they self-incriminate by giving you evidence that they've been making the payments. So that's why you need the period of amnesty. And it's interesting because if you do that and you engage with them, you get the evidence, clearly then you've got something you can go back to a staff member with and present it. But it's definitely not an easy process.
I think we know you with MultiChoice. You've indicated that the journey is just beginning in the organization. So what are the real challenges that you're facing and that you think participating organizations would face in a similar kind of way if they're setting up an ethical or doing business with integrity, trying to create a culture where people can blow the whistle without being bullied or victimized?
I think that first and foremost is leadership commitment. You need to be sure that first your leadership is committed to the process and the project. And
how do you get that?
Sorry, you get that first, but by your governing body of your company needs to embrace it. And then they need to identify within themselves a champion for your project, for your ethics journey. So this can be anyone from your MD or somebody with a senior position. But then the feel and the values need to be shared, because you cannot have one person saying one thing at management and others doing something different. So that's the first thing, leadership commitment. If you don't get that, you start with the wrong foot. As you go about it, you have leadership commitment, decisions are taken, ethics is taken into account, then you need to start implementing. And when you start implementing, it's actually like small steps, but it has to be always reflecting exactly what you decided that you want your culture, you want your values to be. So your leadership needs to actually lead by example, not only say that we're not ethical, so that their decisions and the way they do things are ethical, and they look at ethics, they look at the good for others, they look at the good for their employees. And these are the main challenges. If you don't get that, you will just have words on paper Your governing will say, we want to be ethical, we want to be known as ethical. That's going to be on paper, because on the day-to-day, people will see that that is not exactly what we're doing here, because leadership says something, and then when they come and speak to you, they act some other way, or they ask you to do other things that don't go with what was has the culture that we want to achieve. So leadership commitment is your first challenge, is the first thing that you need to have. After that,
okay, I'm going to just stop you there and ask Chris, what if leadership is the problem? How do you deal with that?
I've had one scenario in my career which was very, very painful, and it did involve having to take a stand and confront. And this was my boss's boss, and the head of legal and compliance. It was extremely painful. They were involved in a practice. I won't disclose the details, but it was clearly not appropriate. And you have to be prepared ultimately to resign over it. And in this particular case, I was being asked to do something that involved misleading regulators, and it was particularly painful. And at that point, you need to have the courage of your convictions to actually state that, no, if you're going to ask me to do that, I'm handing over my card and I'm prepared to leave the organization. Because ultimately you don't want to be tainted from, for all sorts of reasons, because once your credibility is gone and your integrity is bust, it's very difficult to get that back. So I mean, it's very painful. And I hope that I never have to deal with that again. That was some years ago. But I was asked the question, would I do it again? And the answer is absolutely. I mean, look, it's terrifying. I was absolutely petrified. At the time, I was basically warned that I wasn't to leave the building alone because there were people out to get me. After that, and this wasn't in Mozambique, this is on another continent. In Mozambique, obviously, it was the threat of being shot. But my view is you've just got to push through and recognize there is a cost to doing it the right way, and it can be terrifying. But if you ultimately push through and do the right thing, you think about the impact on, it's not just you and the people immediately around you, it's the entire country. And even in the induction sessions that we have face-to-face, and Javita obviously was involved in these as well, my key theme in the inductions with every single new staff member coming in is around integrity. And it's making them understand the long-term impact of what it means to basically end up with increased prices for goods and services, and how that can damage the long-term viability of the company, and obviously damage people's livelihoods. So it's an important theme.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. That's very valuable. I'm going to move on to the ethics journey that you mentioned. And you said, Javita, that clearly having leadership that is committed and behind you is critical. And we've seen how you get the champion who creates the conversations and creates the discussion in the organization. But could you please tell me, how do you enable the discussion when you know that there's resistance amongst staff? And Chris, you can answer this as well. Where do you go? How do you start that discussion when you know that there's resistance?
Okay, so Barbara, I think that like everything in life, unfortunately, we concentrate a lot on whoever's resisting us. With ethics, you should actually concentrate with whoever is buying in to your project. So that's where you go first. You don't try to fight the ones that don't want it, you conquer the ones that want it. So what you want is to increase your ethics champions at your company, which is identify those people that see themselves in those values, have discussions with them, ask them, how they would want the company to be like. What would the feel be for them to say, yes, I'm proud to work in this company. I'm an investor. I trust this company and I trust their best interests. Those are the ones you work with. And what happens is you will identify just a few people. Then there's other people that really want that, but are less of active voices that will then get attracted also to the process. And two things will happen. Either you're resisting, the septics will start seeing the value in it and are there, or they'll see that this is not what I want to be, because they still want to go to do the boladas, they still want to have their way with doing dealings. So I think that you need to really concentrate on those that are willing to embrace the project, that see the value of the project. And this is how you start having the conversations. And the thing is, as one, for example, your top management will not be able to be the only ones talking about it. So as you conquer this, they will be at different levels at the company. So they will continue the conversation at those levels. And this is how you start spreading the conversation, opening up the doors, and showing people that there is a way to address some of the issues that bother them at the company that have to do with behaviors.
Excellent. Chris, you mentioned that it's a journey, and nothing could be further from the truth, because there is always the risk. How do you mitigate that risk in Vodacom, for example? Would you be able to discuss that here on this platform?
Yeah, it's very, very important that, especially at your top leadership in terms of your exco, that you're able to have open discussions around sensitive topics. So where, for example, you have conflicts of interest, and come back to the Kablitishma, and sorry, to clarify, one person put on the question and answer thing about Bulada. Bulada is a positive word. It means deals. It's like, a good deal. But obviously taken out of context, it means it's a deal for me, that I get something out of it. So it's used as a euphemism. The word itself is fine, but when you talk about Bulada in many sectors, everybody knows what you're talking about. So no, just to make sure you at the top level, when you do pick up these issues, and obviously sensitive issues where a conflict of interest is identified, it's very, very important not to put your head in the sand and try and just pretend it doesn't exist. You need to discuss it, and you need to explain what the issue is. And one particular scenario, I won't mention names or the particular incident, but one particular scenario that involved, a person being in a position to influence the purchase of particular items. Now, when I looked at this, and it was a clear conflict of interest for me, because it was obvious that the person was in direct competition with the company. Now, you then start with their management and you ask, has it been disclosed in terms of a conflict of interest policy? Because we have a very clear policy, and any outside business interests or anything that you're involved in that could distract or obviously cause a conflict with your commitment to the company and to the customers needs to be put in writing, discussed with your line manager, and then if it's sensitive enough or considered enough of a challenge, you get legal and compliance involved to actually sign it off. So in this particular case, the conflict hadn't been disclosed. I then sat down with the individual concerned, and it was a very constructive, fruitful discussion, because we ended up in a scenario where he understood what the issue was, and in that case, has stopped doing that particular business, so that the conflict's been removed. So I think, yeah, it's not, there isn't one size fits all for every single scenario, but you do need to actually have openness and transparency at the top of the organization, so that when something is brought to your attention, you can actually constructively deal with it. And whatever you do, don't put your head in the sand, because the problem just grows and it gets bigger and bigger.
Hi, Chris. I think Barbara has dropped from the call. Barbara, are you there? No, I think she's gone. Right, Javita, I just want to ask, I'm just going to jump in here in the middle, but any final comments from your side regarding, this kind of thing and initiatives that you think would work, in organizations? Just replying to Chris.
Okay, I think that one of the things that I would like to share is to all the companies that we will love to have in the coalition, and we are very excited to welcome, is that one of the things that is important to understand, and why do we talk more ethics, or we talk ethics, not exactly compliance, is that people understand purpose. People understand why they will do something, why they will embrace a cause. People understand what are we trying to achieve. They don't really understand rules. They understand that something is forbidden, but the why is more important. And that's what ethics brings. When you start talking about values and principles, you're telling people why, what is there for you? Why is it good for you to be ethical? Why is it good for you to act the right way? So this is the way we are trying to bring the message in. When Leon says that you don't fight corruption by fighting corruption, is actually saying that there's no such thing as a war against corruption. There is actually a change in terms of how people face their day-to-day decisions, how they see the impact of their decisions on the long run. And this is where ethics come in, making people understand that when I pay 10% more to get a contract, I'm actually servicing way worse the people that I'm supposed to service, either because if I have to pay this 10%, I'm not the best candidate, or if I'm the best candidate, it means that the taxpayer is now going to pay more for something that they have a right to have in the best quality, because somebody that's sitting at a certain chair is giving themselves the prerogative of enriching at the cost of the taxpayer. And I've seen examples on the comments here of situations where there's no electricity, when there's been enough investment for people to have electricity, there's no hospitals, there's no public toilets. All of this, if we go and look at the crux of the problem, we will see that it was because somebody was sitting at a certain chair and getting kickbacks for work that he was being paid rightfully to do, but on the same token, he was getting kickbacks from the other side. So at the end of the day, it's not good for the business, because the business ends spending more money, and it's not good for the general public.
Thanks, Javita. I think that's so important what you've just said. I see Barbara's back, so I'm going to relinquish my facilitator role in the interim. But I think just to leave you guys with something interesting from my side, just to talk a little bit around this, is that I've noticed more and more companies being unwilling to move into countries where bribery occurs and where there is corruption. Seen a telecom recently in South Africa, Chris, not yours, that got involved in Afghanistan with bribery to keep cell phone towers up and running. Otherwise, they would be bombed. And I think this company is really considering to withdraw the economic incentives, their work, their investment out of that country, because it's putting them at global risk in terms of their performance and their reputation. So it's so true what you just said. Barbara, I'm out of here. Over to you.
Great. I apologize enormously for that glitch, and I think we are running out of time, so I'm going to just ask you, Chris and Javita, to just give a closing statement, really, in terms of two things. The first is, why should companies, look, we've had the presentations, but why, from your perspective, should companies join the coalition? And secondly, what do you think that the coalition can do for organizations in Mozambique?
Okay.
Start with you, Chris.
Yeah, very, very important question. So we, in the supplier forums that we run on a quarterly basis, we literally discuss this as an open issue, and myself, alongside the MD, ask the suppliers to join us as a a microeconomy, if you want, within Mozambique and commit to one another to doing business in an ethical manner. So if we can get more people, more companies to effectively do the same thing, join together. And I tell you what's fantastic is I have not yet met a supplier because I have these face-to-face discussions with the MD or FD of the suppliers. I haven't yet met a supplier that wants to do business in an unethical manner. They all want to work together with us to drive out this culture. So I think this is an excellent opportunity to do it. So from my point of view, this is almost like the timing's really good because I wanted to have some sort of public way of demonstrating that we're all committed to it. So if it's almost like you wear a badge, not saying that you are squeaky clean, because that's nonsense. As I said before, we're on a journey, but as this is what we're striving for. This is why we passionately love Mozambique, think it's the most incredible country I've worked in, and it's the people. I love the people, the Mozambican people. And when I hear of 150,000 Rand toilets, we've got our own versions and our own stories of the similar thing that goes on. It really pains me at an individual level to see the impact on the poorest of the poor in the country suffering the consequences. So I think for me, it's a great opportunity to stand together and fight. And I know you say we mustn't fight corruption by fighting corruption. And yes, that is true. But effectively, you need a deep commitment to the people of Mozambique to do the right thing and to work together.
Right. So, thank you. Javita.
Okay. Actually, I have started. I have a bit of answering why joining a coalition like this. But I think that's the most important part is what Dion very well said. Collective action has is a strong tool to make change in a bigger scale. So if we want to change our companies, yes, but we want that to be reflected in the environment that we do business. So I think that's one of the reasons why a coalition like that makes sense. Is we want to change the way we do business, but we want also to make it easier to do business with others. Because if I embrace ethical values and I say that I only do business this way, I need to have a network of partners that also embrace the same values. I think
that's good. Thank you.
Second point.
Okay, just quickly.
Yeah, just one other thing. I think that also the second point is a coalition of integrity in Mozambique allows us also to have a platform to discuss our issues that are very common to us as a Mozambican business society, because there are a lot of concepts that are universal, but then they need to be contextualized. We need to look at things of interest in our perspective. We need to look at in our perspective. Of course, I'm not saying that there's the full concept can be changed, but then there are intricacies of how we do business in Mozambique and what happens in the factors that affect it that can only be discussed in a forum of companies in this context. Of course, to change the wrong and to empower the ones that we see that are strong.
Awesome. Thank you so much to both of you for excellent input. I'm so sorry about disappearing at the most exciting part of the discussion. Don't take it personally. The thing I wanted to say in terms of commitment is this project is a 5-year project. It's not just a once-off. So in terms of the commitment of the institution, the TI and the institution supporting Siemens, it's a 5-year extended project, and we look forward to dealing with those specifics that you've mentioned, Javita. And just a reminder, please to let us have those issues in the chat so that we can take them forward. I'm going to hand over to Professor Leon now just to look at the next steps, and then we have a quick transfer to Dion to answer one of the questions that's in the Q&A, and then some closing remarks. Over to you, Leon.
Thank you, Barbara. Thanks for that. The question is now, what happens next? So what? So we have this great initiative going, but it's important that we understand the next steps. So let me just take you through them very briefly. First is that you'll receive notification of our website launch very, very soon. And the link you see on the screen there, although you will receive notification if you participate today, but the slides will also be made available to you soon after today's session. So the next step then is please register your organization as a supporter on the website. Sign up as a supporter to this coalition, and let's make a difference together. Also participate, please, in assessments offered by we will arrange that a pool contact the organizations contact us, those who require assessments done. Remember the first six organizations, as far as Celia, please stand corrected, but can actually get these free of charge. But we can talk about that at a later in time. Then please attend our best practice sharing sessions. Now, what we need from you is that you need to share on the website with us, or even via email, is relevant issues to be discussed during the best practice sharing sessions. And here I would like to actually answer the question by Brian Kagoru. Brian, you asked two very, very important questions about meritocracy, the influence of families, culture. These are very, very important issues in business, and particularly the way business is being conducted in Mozambique. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that please raise these as discussion points in future for these best practice sharing sessions, because your organization is not the only one struggling with these challenges. So let's talk about it in future. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go through all that today, but we have acknowledged your question. It's a very good question, and we'll deal with it in future at one of our sessions. I think these, of course, are aligned to the issues that Javita pointed out. The great thing about a coalition is that it's a forum where issues can be shared and discussed, and then joint action can be discussed and decided on. Before I hand over to Barbara to wrap up, I would like to just say a word of thanks to Siemens. We have some of their delegates that have popped into today to say hello and that are attended the session, Sean and Margarita, and we really appreciate the Siemens support, and also the fact that you trust the Ethics Institute to spend the funding responsibly and accountably. So thank you for that, and it was great working with you, and we look forward to the next 4.5 years as well. Then lastly, I would really like to extend a word of thanks to all my colleagues that made such great presentations today. Dion, extremely insightful. It's a deep thought went into this, and one should really take note of this. Paul, also from your side, thank you very much. It was a professional approach, and the way that you explained what we can measure, what we can do for organizations in terms of the measurement, and that one can actually measure ethics. I think that is that is very positive. And then to Barbara and other colleagues that helped make this possible, but most importantly, Celia, your work behind the scenes, your networking, your enthusiasm, your empathy, it all shines through in the way that this project is run, the way that the coalition was constituted, the way that we're going to work together in future. So hats off to you, Celia. A big hug to you. Thank you very, very much. Back to Barbara.
Thank you very much. And a big thank you. I'm not going to repeat all the thanks, but just to say that the coalition is now official. And so we look forward to your active participation. We will be following up our connection with you to take it forward. And again, thank you to TEI, to Leon, Dion, Paul, Celia, and somebody we've left out, Fernanda Fazenda, for your excellent support in getting this project underway. And we really do intend making a tangible impact, but obviously that's your work and we will support you as much as we can. Please don't hesitate to contact us and keep a lookout for our newsletter. Do give us feedback. The exciting thing is we've already got a date for our next best practice sharing session, and that will take place on the 22nd of July. And we will communicate with you to provide that information so that you can attend. And we look forward to hearing your issues, hearing about your issues so that we can deal with them in that forum. So again, thank you very much. And could I wish you all well, stay safe from this dreaded virus, and keep fighting the good fight. Thank you so much.